Often, and especially in the Netherlands, when discussing the Japanese occupation of Indonesia or the Dutch East Indies, it is about the terrible fate of the Dutch citizens that were interned in camps or put to forced labor. Not often there's attention to the suffering of the Indonesian people under Japanese rule, because an estimated 4 million of them did not survive the Japanese occupation. That makes Indonesia one of the worst hit countries of the Second World War, yet it is often overlooked. Why did so many Indonesians die? You'll find out today. Whenever we think of countries that suffered at the hands of the Axis powers, many people think of Poland, the USSR, or China, but Indonesia is often overlooked. It must be said that Indonesia was one of the hardest hit countries during this global conflict. The Japanese occupation and its consequences devastated the country, as Belgian historian David van Rijbroek wrote. Out of a population of 68 million, a United Nations study put the number of deaths in Indonesia at no less than 4 million, almost 6%. It hardly registered internationally, but Indonesia emerged from World War II as one of the worst hit countries. The Indonesian death toll was the 5th highest globally, after the Soviet Union, China, Germany, and Poland, and before Japan. For civilian deaths, it was the highest. World War II had a tremendous effect on Indonesia. The Japanese disrupted its society. Think of it, if modern society disappeared tomorrow, what knowledge would humans need to rebuild technology, industry, medicine, agriculture, transportation, and civilization itself from scratch? I recently got my hands on the book, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization. At first I thought it was just a beautiful coffee table book. Ancient civilizations, lost technologies, stunning illustrations, pages on how humanity discovered electricity, built machines, purified water, and even how to rebuild civilization from scratch. But then I noticed something interesting. Hidden between the pages were ciphers, symbols, messages that didn't quite make sense. You can actually decode these messages, and that makes this not just a book, but also a quest. The whole project started Kickstarter and resulted in a book that is not just a book. It's part encyclopedia, part puzzle box, part mystery game. And honestly, it goes deeper than you think. More than 50 professionals worked on this project, and according to its creators, there's an entire second layer of riddles hidden throughout the book. If you solve them all, you can join something called the Order of Seekers, a secret community that sends real rewards to people who complete the quest. Only 7 people in the world have solved all of it so far. Will you be the 8th? Check out the book by clicking on the link in the pinned comment or video description, or scan the QR code for 10% off. Use the code HistoryHustle10. So how did so many Indonesian people die? Did the Japanese wage a war for extermination over there? Was there endless and vicious fighting all the time? Countless bombing raids? No. To explain this, we need to start at the beginning, and that was in June 1941. Then, the Dutch said no to Japan. See, Indonesia was under Dutch colonial control and was known as the Dutch East Indies. Centuries ago, the Dutch started being active in the area as spice traders, and over the course of the 19th century, the Dutch completed their colonial conquest of the archipelago. It must be noted though that some areas were never truly pacified. Take for example Aceh, where the Dutch waged a bloody colonial war from 1873 till 1914-ish. Because like I said, the unrest was never quelled. When in June 1941, the talks between Japan and the Netherlands over Dutch oil deliveries to Japan had deadlocked, Japan realized it needed to get the oil from the Dutch East Indies by force. If that would result in war with Britain and the US, then that was to be taken for granted. What is interesting is that the Dutch declared war on Japan first, after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. The Dutch felt emboldened by their allies. The British and American declarations of war followed shortly after. Japan only declared war against the Netherlands on the 11th of January 1941, when they invaded Borneo and Sulawesi. The Japanese invasion of the Dutch East Indies was perhaps one of the most swift invasions in history. In some places, the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army, the KNIL, fought against the Japanese, but the Dutch colonial forces were a de facto police army to repel inland rebellions, not to fend off a full-scale invasion by a modern army. Besides, the land army was considered the third line of defense after the Air Force and Navy. With Japan dominating the skies quickly as well as the sea lanes, we can say that the fate of the Dutch East Indies was pretty much sealed. Some small-scale battles took place on Java, but on March 8th, Dutch Governor-General van Starkenborst de Gouwer and Lieutenant General Ter Poorten arrived at Kalijati, where Japanese commander Hitoshi Imamura awaited them. Initially, the Dutch didn't want to surrender the full archipelago, but under Japanese pressure did so. Not even 1,000 Japanese soldiers were killed during the conquest. Thousands of Allied soldiers died. Many more would perish in Japanese captivity. But this video isn't about them. This video is about the Indonesians. How did they perceive the appearance of the soldiers of Japan? A then 14-year-old boy witnessed the first Japanese landings near his village of Kema on the tip of Sulawesi's northern peninsula. This was where, on the 11th of January 1942, the first Japanese troops landed. My parents took me to Bitung harbor to see. We listened to speeches by the Japanese. It took a couple of hours. The Dutch had left, they told us. Now Japan was in charge of everything, and the Japanese administration would work with Indonesian officials. Another Indonesian recalled how he and his family initially fled, but later encountered Japanese who gave them sugar and broken wrist watches. Another eyewitness recalled, "There wasn't much fighting in our area. There were no Dutch troops left. When the Japanese arrived, the villagers fled into the forest. I was 12. We children had to catch chickens for them to eat." It must be said that a great deal of the Dutch colonial army was Indonesian. One Indonesian recalled how his uncle served in the colonial army. He was used to seeing him in uniform. He wore long dark green trousers with tapered legs with pockets on them. But when the Japanese arrived, he didn't feel like fighting and getting killed. The KNL hardly put up a fight anyway. They gave everything away, including their vehicles. The Europeans were being taken prisoner, but he was afraid he would be killed. He took off his uniform and went home in his underwear. I was playing football outside and I couldn't believe my eyes. He came walking up in his underpants and singlet and shouted, "Quick, lock the door." For the next 2 or 3 days, he didn't come outside. It must be noted that most of the Indonesian KNIL POWs were released by April 1942. The Japanese had other plans for them. From the get-go, cruel things happened, and these things would only increase. Although Japanese General Imamura had ordered his troops to behave, massacres of POWs and civilians occurred. Both Indonesian and European women became victims of abuse, yet in many places the Japanese were welcomed with Japanese flags. Though there exist Japanese propaganda films in which the streets are filled with Indonesians celebrating the Japanese arrival, many of them were full of hope when the Japanese took control over the archipelago with the slogan, "Asia for Asians." One person recalled the sentiment. "Here are Asians who never studied at a European university, and they can defeat a world power just like that." Right after the Japanese takeover, the Japanese set up a propaganda machine. Young members of the Indonesian intelligentsia were allowed to write friendly pieces in the newly established journal, Asia Raya, Great Asia, about the fall of the West and the rise of the land of the rising sun. Life in Jakarta, as Batavia was now named, became a world of rigid rules and mandatory submission under Japanese occupation. The new authorities outlawed activities as simple as roller skating near Japanese residences, banned women from wearing trousers, and forbade smoking for anyone under the age of 20. Anyone encountering a Japanese soldier was forced to perform a debow, and cyclists had to dismount immediately or face a violent beating. One Indonesian coffee seller recalled, "I was scared of them if you forgot to bow. They hit you if that knocked you over. They kicked you while you were down. Our Asian brothers, they were kayam, brutal, cruel, and implacable." Java fell under the military authority of the 16th Army, Sumatra under the 25th Army, and the outer islands under the Navy. The goal across the islands was identical: to beat Japanese reverence into the population while forcibly extracting every trace of Western culture. The institutional erasure of Dutch influence was swift. Banks were shuttered, political groups were banned, and the media was completely dismantled. In their place, the Japanese installed public loudspeakers that broadcast propaganda and the national anthem, Kimigayo, throughout the day. While broadcasts were made in local languages like Indonesian or Javanese, the Dutch language was strictly prohibited. Control extended into the home, where radios were physically locked to prevent citizens from tuning into anything other than official Japanese stations. Violating this rule by listening to foreign broadcasts was a crime punishable by death. Cultural life was similarly overhauled to serve the state. Movie theaters were given Japanese names and screened only approved films that glorified patriotism, respect for elders, and traditional femininity. To ensure the message reached the masses, ticket prices were lowered and outdoor screenings were held in the countryside, sometimes drawing audiences of over 1 million people. The AAA campaign was launched, in which Japan was portrayed as Asia's light, protector, and leader. This ideological shift required a total change in vocabulary and daily habits. People were told to say Nippon instead of Japan, and Southern Territories instead of the Dutch East Indies. Major landmarks and holidays were renamed to honor the emperor rather than the Dutch queen. Every detail of life was synchronized with Tokyo. The calendar was moved forward to the year 2602, and clocks were set an hour and a half ahead to match Japanese time. Eventually, even the currency transitioned from Japanese printed guilders to the rupiah, completing the total systematic removal of the old colonial identity. The Japanese viewed the Chinese population with great suspicion. They worked hard to get along. One person recalled that her Chinese mother adopted a Japanese name and wore a kimono. Then there were also the Indo-Europeans. In colonial society, they had always been a little too Asian for the Dutch, and now they proved to be too European for the Japanese. Bol Keramine said, "Japan wanted us on their side. On the outside, I do look like an Indonesian. I'm a half-blood. But on the inside, I was staunchly in the Dutch camp. Every Japanese is one too many. That's what I thought." Indonesian nationalists who had been incarcerated by the Dutch were set free. Sukarno and Hatta became advisors for the Japanese. Sultan Syahrir decided to distance himself from the Japanese and kept a low profile. Sukarno believed that working with the Japanese would bring his dream of an independent Indonesia. The Indonesian language was promoted, but the red and white flag remained banned, and none of the nationalist leaders were promoted to high positions. That was because the Japanese leaders did not feel entirely sure of them. How reliable were these nationalists? Therefore, Japan preferred to work with the organized Islam. This religious movement was seen as apolitical and had many members, especially in rural areas. The Japanese invested in education, and both Indonesian and Japanese were taught at schools. More Indonesian children went to school during the Japanese occupation than under Dutch rule. It brought more opportunities for Indonesian girls especially. Yet, we must note it also became more dangerous for girls and young women, as they became prey to Japanese abuse. Many were abducted, others went into hiding. One woman recalled, "I took a Japanese course, purely in self-defense. After all, if you spoke Japanese, they didn't take liberties. A girlfriend and I received private lessons from a Japanese officer, Mr. Mimura, who was around the age of 40. He was like a father to us. He had daughters of his own back at home and would never have dreamed of brutalizing us. These women were lucky. Approximately 20,000 Indonesian women and girls were used as comfort women by the Japanese. The Japanese needed labor for the construction of railway projects both in Indonesia and abroad. The Burma Railway was built so Japan could transport supplies to its forces in Burma without relying on the long sea route around the Malay Peninsula, which was dangerous because of British submarines regularly patrolled the area. Burma was strategically very important to Japan because controlling it cut central China off from coastal access, provided fertile rice-producing land and some oil resources, and created a route toward British India. The route covered more than 400 kilometers of harsh, heavily forested landscape marked by cool nights and relentless tropical heat during the day. Along the way, workers had to construct around 600 bridges. The Burma Railway became the biggest wartime construction project in Southeast Asia that relied on forced labor. Japan transported around 62,000 prisoners of war to work on it, including about 30,000 British, 18,000 Dutch, 13,000 Australians and several hundred Americans. Among the Dutch colonial army, the KNIL prisoners were also soldiers from the Moluccas. In addition, tens of thousands of Asian laborers called romushas were forced to take part in the construction. Estimates of their numbers range from 70 to 190,000 people. Originally, the railway was expected to take up to 5 years to complete. However, as Japan's position in the war worsened and military losses increased, the schedule became more demanding. The deadline was first reduced to a year and a half and later to only 1 year. Under these brutal conditions, laborers who were already weak from exhaustion, hunger, and disease were sometimes ordered to move as much as 3.5 cubic meters of earth per person each day. The death figures were very high. Out of 62,000 Allied prisoners, about 13,000 did not survive. Among the romushas, the Asian forced laborers, the death rate was about 50%. And the total number of people who died may have been around 100,000, where some volunteered only to find out the working conditions were not what they had been promised. Others were recruited by force. One man from Java recalled, "My parents were rice farmers near Bogor. My father hoed the fields. One day the Japanese army just took him away. I was playing and saw it happen. They trained their guns on him. I wanted to go with him, but they pushed me away. He was sent overseas. It was the last time I saw him. I was 9 years old." Inside Indonesia, forced labor was also used. The railway in West Java was built to carry coal from inland mining areas to the southern coast. But the number of people who died during its construction remains uncertain. Estimates range from 15,000 to as many as 60,000 deaths, and the true figure may never be known. A similar tragedy unfolded during the construction of the Pekanbaru Railway in Sumatra. Around 7,000 prisoners of war and possibly 120,000 Javanese romushas were forced to work on the line. It is believed that roughly 80,000 of them died, despite the fact that the railway intended for transporting coal was only finished on the final day of the war, making their suffering effectively pointless. Other major wartime building projects were equally deadly. For example, around 24,000 people are thought to have died constructing airfields in Flores and on the Moluccas. One person from Java was put to work on the island Muna near Sulawesi. He worked as a supervisor, a so-called mandor, and later recalled the following. We were given 1 day off a month. If something went wrong at work, the mandors had to step in. We would then be scrubbed down, followed by severe beating. We were usually beaten with a stick, mostly on the head. In the course of a year, 100 coolies died on Muna, mostly due to the lack of food. Twice I complained to a Japanese officer about the food. Both times the result was a severe beating. The exact number of Indonesian romushas who died during World War II is unknown, but historians estimate it was in the hundreds of thousands. Most estimates place the death toll between 300,000 and 500,000, though some researchers believe it may have been even higher. One person who can also be held accountable was none other than nationalist leader Sukarno, who actively recruited many of his fellow countrymen. During the war, he protested against the bad treatment of romushas, and when he was asked about it after the war, he replied as follows. In reality, they were slaves. I knew they were skin and bones and I couldn't help them. But if I have to sacrifice thousands to save millions, then I will do so. As a leader of this country, I cannot afford the luxury of sentimentality. On the 5th of December 1942, Sukarno delivered his first radio speech under Japanese occupation, marking a major turning point in his political influence. After being released by the Japanese, he went from being persecuted under Dutch colonial rule to becoming a respected advisor to the Japanese authorities in Java, even earning a salary and enjoying privileges such as a villa and a car taken from former Dutch owners. He traveled widely across Java, meeting key nationalist, Islamic and educational leaders, and was free to speak and organize without interference. His radio address reached a far wider audience than anything possible under Dutch rule, as Japanese-controlled loudspeakers amplified his message across public spaces, allowing hundreds of thousands of Indonesians to hear his voice for the first time. The speech marked the beginning of Sukarno's emergence as a mass political figure on an unprecedented national scale. If this war does not end in victory, all of our aspirations, all of our hopes, all of our efforts will be shattered, and we shall once again suffer and be oppressed and exploited by Allied imperialism. Only a Japanese victory can save us, can save all of Asia. He knew, of course, that he had made himself a willing mouthpiece of Japanese propaganda, but his attitude was pragmatic, as he later claimed. The Japanese needed me, and I was aware of that. But I also needed them to make my country ready for revolution. In March 1943, on the first anniversary of the capture of Java, Sukarno spoke in the center of the capital to a crowd of around 200,000 people. Batavia had officially been renamed Jakarta in December 1942, and the statue of Dutch East India Company pioneer Jan Pieterszoon Koen on the town square had been pulled down.
Seluruh bangsa Indonesia mengetahui tentang patung Jan Pieterszoon Koen karena patung itu suatu simbol kemakmuran untuk bangsa Belanda, tetapi untuk bangsa Indonesia suatu simbol perbudakan. Selama di bawah pemerintah Belanda almarhum, berjuta-juta bangsa Indonesia hidupnya dalam cengkeraman imperialisme Belanda.
Sukarno announced the establishment of the Putera, Center of People's Power. This organization replaced the AAA and was to be run by Sukarno in cooperation with Muhammad Hatta under Japanese supervision. The AAA was too much top-down, and Putera was a way of winning hearts and minds to the war effort with the help of influential Indonesians. The Japanese began drilling young Indonesians. In April 1943, the Japanese raised a force of young volunteers known as the Pedoman Sainandan, which means youth column. The age limits were 14 to 25, later reduced to 22. Mostly raised in urban areas, these youngsters were trained with dummy rifles, as the Japanese were careful to arm them with real rifles, despite having a considerable amount of booty captured from the Royal Netherlands Indies Army. By the war's end, the formation counted for 600,000 men, including units formed in factories and on farms. The Kaibodan Vigilance Corps was a mass organization for older men aged 25 to 35. These men had to perform local security patrols and air raid precautions. The men of the Kaibodan were given basic military training and bamboo spears to act as a home guard in case of any Allied landings, and over 1 million Indonesian men were part of this group. The Haiho served as auxiliaries, raised from mid-1943, was another pro-Japanese Indonesian force that attracted some 25,000 former indigenous KNL personnel, as large numbers of Ambonese and Manadonese POWs were released. They had to take an oath of loyalty to Japan and were sent wherever needed, New Guinea and the distant South Pacific islands of New Britain and Bougainville. Those serving under the Navy were sent to the Pacific Islands, the Philippines, and even Burma. Java was the most populous and developed island. The Japanese had only 8,500 troops there, and thus they had to rely on a paramilitary force from the Indonesian population. This force became known as PITA, meaning Defenders of the Homeland. Recruited near the end of 1943 on Java, almost 40,000 men were organized into 69 battalions. These forces were supposed to be fully armed, yet shortage of small arms made this hard to realize. As one former Haiho soldier recalled, "Ouch, they were so strict. Couldn't speak proper Japanese? They beat you. Didn't stand up straight for a roll call? They beat you. And if you keeled over during a march, no one looked back. But I was put in charge of a 40-man section. I was the only one with a gun." I did make an elaborate video on this topic. See the link up here or in the video description. Frustrations among the Indonesians began to grow. Burma and the Philippines had been declared independent by Japanese Prime Minister Tojo early 1943, although they were still part of the Japanese Empire. This was not to be for Indonesia. Indonesia had too many strategic resources for Japan. During the 1943 Greater East Asia Conference in Tokyo, Indonesia was not even represented. If 1942 was the year of politicalization, and 1943 the year of militarization, 1944 proved to be the year of total mobilization. Japan, fearing invasion, wanted total mobilization of the Indonesians working in agriculture, mining, and infrastructure. Japan had become a very nervous occupying power. The Putera organization was replaced by two new organizations, the Central Advisory Council and Jawa Holokai, the Java Service Association, to realize the mass mobilization. One young man was sent to a refinery and later recalled. "It was fun in the beginning. That Japanese uniform discipline was strict, but we learned useful skills. Me and 700 other students slept in a huge warehouse under a sugarcane roof. When the air raid siren sounded, we all had to go to the underground shelter. To reduce the probability of bombing, the Japanese even built a decoy of our factory. One night I saw an enemy American aircraft being caught by 3 large searchlights and shot at from the ground." As time progressed, many Indonesians realized the Japanese hadn't come to liberate them, but to exploit them and take away their resources. He continued, "The Japanese were bad at feeding people. Our usual staple food is rice, but rice became expensive, so we were given rice mixed with maize. Eventually, it was only 20% rice and 80% maize. But meanwhile, we could see trucks driving past loaded with rice. Japan or the Netherlands?" His conclusion was clear. Colonialism is colonialism. And that brings me to the greatest cause of death in Indonesia during World War II. Famine. Rice became more and more expensive as 1944 progressed. In just several weeks, the price had risen from 35 to 80 cents and then to 1.40 guilder, and in June 1945 it would soar to 2.10 and then peak not long afterwards at 7.50 guilder. Java was one of the most fertile rice-growing areas. After 2 difficult years under occupation, the economy had largely collapsed. Agricultural exports had stopped, irrigation networks were poorly maintained, and the number of livestock was steadily declining. As a result, soil erosion worsened, rice fields deteriorated, and roads fell into disrepair. There were fewer cows and buffaloes available to plow the land, fewer trucks and trains to transport rice to urban areas, and fewer men able to work their fields full-time because many were forced into labor for the Japanese occupation authorities. To make matters worse, 1944 turned out to be an exceptionally dry year, one of the driest recorded. Fortunately, the years immediately before and after were unusually wet. Under ordinary conditions, reserves would likely have been enough to cope with this temporary setback. But these were far from ordinary circumstances, and the main reason was not the drought itself, but the demands and the policies of the Japanese military. The soaring price of rice during the Japanese occupation was caused mainly by poor government policy rather than drought alone. The Japanese military administration in Java centralized rice distribution by forcing farmers to sell fixed amounts of rice to the government at very low prices. Officials then attempted to distribute the rice through a controlled system with fixed prices. However, the system depended on functioning transport networks, and wartime conditions had devastated Java's railways and trucking capacity. As transport collapsed, smuggling and black market trade became widespread. Farmers hid rice to sell it illegally at far higher prices, while corruption spread throughout the distribution chain. Large amounts of rice disappeared into the black market, even as cities faced severe shortages and soaring prices. The system created a vicious cycle. Shortages led to stricter demands from authorities, which encouraged even more hoarding and smuggling. In some fertile regions, rice was left to rot, while elsewhere people went hungry. Farmers also lost the incentive to produce surplus rice because official prices were too low. As a result, rice production in Java fell dramatically from 8.5 million tons in 1939 to only 5.6 million tons in 1945. The famine of 1944-45 was therefore caused less by natural conditions than by the ineffective and damaging policies of the Japanese occupation authorities. Survivors recalled. We no longer had any rice and ate papaya leaves with soy sauce. Even boiled, they were bitter. All we had to eat was old, dry cassava, indigestible. Those were the worst days of my life. We were so hungry. We ate only twice a day. We ate only once a day. The sight of walking skeletons no longer surprised us. We saw many dead bodies on the streets. We saw the sick and the dead lying all over the place. Out in the streets, under the trees, at the edge of the forest, corpses were just like litter. In absolute figures, 2.4 million died. Spontaneous riots against Japanese rule occurred, but were always local and short-lived and met with brute force. These local uprisings never formed a threat to the regime as a whole. In February 1945, a mutiny took place perpetrated by PETA soldiers on Blitar, Java. This was the largest armed uprising during the Japanese occupation of Indonesia. Around 400 PETA soldiers rebelled to free 250 prisoners. What shocked the Japanese was that the revolt came not from civilians, nor communists, no, but from PETA troops, Indonesians trained and organized by Japan itself. In its aftermath, 6 rebels were executed, unusually lenient for such a defiance. There existed underground groups that smuggled weapons and counterfeit currency production, Prominent nationalist figures like Sultan Shahrir and even Sukarno were secretly connected to or supporting the resistance in different ways. Sukarno publicly cooperated with the Japanese, but also maintained hidden contact with underground groups to balance political survival and prepare for Indonesia's future independence. On Kalimantan, Japanese paranoia led to mass arrests and the execution of over 1,500 civilians, many of whom had no proven connection to resistance activity. Entire families, educators, and former colonial officials were imprisoned, tortured, and killed based on suspicion alone, even when no actual acts of resistance had occurred. In order to quell rising public unrest, Japan, driven more by strategic necessity than genuine altruism, became willing to offer significant compromises. Domestic struggles with famine and poverty had sparked internal defiance at the very moment Japan needed to focus on its military borders. The leadership recognized it simply could not fight a domestic uprising and an international war simultaneously. On September 7, 1944, amidst severe drought, Prime Minister Kuniaki Koiso attempted to ease the tensions by making a monumental, though loosely defined declaration to the Indonesian representatives. He announced that Indonesia would be granted independence in the future, suggesting a level of self-governance within the Japanese Empire, similar to the status held by Burma and the Philippines. A year later, on August 9, 1945, Sukarno met with Field Marshal Hisashi Terauchi, supreme commander of the Japanese troops in all of Southeast Asia, in Saigon, occupied Vietnam. On the day, the A-bomb was released over Nagasaki and the Soviets invaded Manchuria. Terauchi gave them formal notification that Japan had decided to grant Indonesia independence. On the 14th of August, Sukarno returned to Jakarta, and that same evening, a committee was assembled, the Preparatory Committee for Indonesian Independence. Their first meeting was planned for August 18th, and the transfer of power would take place soon thereafter. Yet, on August 15th, everything changed. That day, Japan surrendered. According to United Nations research, Indonesia suffered a staggering loss of at least 4 million lives, roughly 6% of its 68 million strong population. Despite receiving relatively little global attention, Indonesia was among the most devastated nations of World War II. Its total casualties ranked 5th in the world, surpassed only by the Soviet Union, China, Germany, and Poland, and exceeding those of Japan itself. Notably, Indonesia endured the highest number of civilian deaths in any country during the conflict. In Japan and Germany, civilians made up 23.3% and 28.4% of the victims, respectively. In the Soviet Union, 57.8%, in China, 81%, in Poland, around 96%, but Indonesia was worst of all, 99.7%. What's more, these innocent victims fell in a war that was never theirs, dying of starvation and deprivation in a military and economic clash between Japan and the Netherlands for the mineral wealth of their country. When Japan surrendered mid-August 1945, Indonesia was left in chaos and on the brink of revolution. The Japanese occupation had collapsed almost overnight. Japanese units still controlled the cities, but their empire was no more. In this power vacuum stepped Indonesian nationalists, who had spent years preparing under Japanese supervision. On August 17, 1945, just 2 days after Japan's surrender, Sukarno proclaimed Indonesia's independence in Jakarta. Across the islands, youth groups and militias took up arms, seizing weapons, police stations, and government offices. The situation quickly spiraled into violence. With the Dutch still imprisoned by Japan and the Allied forces slow to arrive, radical youth groups saw an opportunity to wipe out any trace of colonial rule. This period from late 1945 into 1946 became known as the Bersiap, meaning get ready in Indonesian. It was a chaotic violence phase marked by revenge attacks against Europeans, Indo-Europeans and perceived collaborators. Thousands of men, women and children were killed, and social order collapsed in many areas. When British and later Dutch troops eventually returned, they found the country transformed. The old colonial hierarchy was gone, replaced by armed Indonesians demanding independence. What followed was the Indonesian War of Independence from 1945 to 1949, a brutal 4-year conflict. Don't forget to check out the book The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization by clicking on the link in the pinned comment or video description, or scan the QR code for 10% off. Use the code HistoryHustle10. I did make several videos on the topic of the Dutch-Indonesian War in the past months. If you are unfamiliar, start with this one. Thanks for watching.